Thank you, Arthur. And I'm again very happy to be doing this again. I'm very sorry if the weather complicated things, so I can't be there in person. Just a couple of things with Arthur's intro. So I was also trying to remember how often I've done this, and I'm not sure of the exact number, but I do remember the first time I did this was for the Darwin celebration, the 200th anniversary of Darwin's birth in 2009. So it's been quite a few years. Um, Also, just clarity, I'm no longer the chair of the religion department. That's moved on, but I am now I'm in the religion department and I direct the cognitive science program at Hofstra. So again, so thank you those there and on Zoom for inviting me back. My talk today is the Scopes monkey trial 100 years later. July of this year will be the 100th anniversary of the first of the famous trials over the teaching of evolution. And so as you see, the subtitle is Lessons on the Moral Significance of Science. And I'm going to focus on the moral significance. Obviously, science is incredibly important intellectually, clinically, and that's part of its moral significance. But I do want to talk about a broader moral significance of science. So I just want to start with just a quick overview of the Scopes trial. Many of you would be familiar with much of it. If you've seen Inherit the Wind or the famous movie and first the play, that does a fairly good, presentation of the issues, the events. It's it's a movie, it's a play, so it's a little over dramatized, conflates and condenses some of the information, but it's a very good introduction to the issues. So I just want to go quickly over that, but really talk more about the deeper issues and resonances from that trial. So this was in July of 1925. In that year, in Tennessee, Tennessee passed the first anti-evolution law, state law in the country called the Butler Act. And this prohibited the teaching of evolution in public schools. It prohibited teaching anything that contradicted the creation story in Genesis or suggested that humans were descended from a lower species of organism. As soon as this went on the books, the American Civil Liberties Union, which was just getting started around that period, sought to challenge the law as unconstitutional, and they offered to defend for free anyone who would be willing to break the law. And the person who ended up being the defendant in the case, John T. Scopes. So again, the interesting background about this, which doesn't come through in the movie, is that Scopes was chosen to be the defendant by a group of local business people in Dayton, Tennessee, who felt that this would be great for tourism and great for business, that it would bring a lot of attention to Dayton. And John T. Scopes was a substitute teacher. He was the football coach at the local school, but he volunteered to do this, and he did substitute as a biology teacher on a couple of occasions. He admitted that he was not quite sure if he ever taught about evolution, but the textbook that they were using, which had been approved by the state of Tennessee Board of Education before the law came in, did include a lesson on evolution. So he willingly admitted that he taught about evolution and was charged with violating the law. This again quickly did become a trial of the century, and the thing that really brought it to the fore were the lawyers for the prosecution and one of the lawyers for the defense. The ACLU came in, but quickly, and they were not completely happy about this. They got the voluntary work of Clarence Darrow. And Clarence Darrow at this time, if you're familiar or not, was probably the most famous and infamous lawyer in the United States. He was a fierce defender of the poor and the oppressed. And he was an unapologetic, though non-dogmatic, atheist. On the other side was William Jennings Bryan, who was the most famous political figure in the country at the time. He had unsuccessfully run for president 3 times, had served as a Secretary of State, and was, a famous public speaker. Uh, he was known as the Great Commoner because he was, again, as Darrow, a passionate defender of poor and oppressed groups, particularly against corporate power. And Bryant was an evangelical fundamentalist Christian. So the battle of these two giants was set up. And the business interests who thought this would bring tourism to Dayton were absolutely correct. This became the event of the year, of the century. Media descended in droves upon this small little town. It was the first trial ever to be broadcast across the country. So radio is, is the prime media, and being able to broadcast nationally, it turned into somewhat of a circus and did bring a lot of attention to Dayton. It also brought H.L. Mencken, who was one of the most well-known and somewhat controversial journalists from the Baltimore Sun to cover the trial. And Mencken was not neutral in the issue of evolution versus state rights or evolution versus religion. Was quite critical both of Bryan and some bias against the South in general. It was Mencken who coined the term the monkey trial, and he also coined the term the Bible Belt for that part of the country. So this is a trial that's most famously seen as a debate between religion and science, right? Evolution versus the Bible, religion versus reason versus superstition. And those were all certainly at play. But there's really a more nuanced story to tell about this trial. And I highly recommend a recent book that's provided me with some of the resources, some more information about the trial that I was unaware of. Is called Keeping the Faith, God, Democracy, and the Trial That Riveted a Nation by Brenda Wineapple. It's a wonderful book, very informative, very well written, it's a good read. So again, she's providing a different context for this. So she points out, and is absolutely correct, that this trial was really about what kind of a nation the United States is and what kind of a nation it was going to be, right? This is taking place in the wake of the Gilded Age, an age of tremendous power of plutocrats and increasing inequality, a pushback against, this is also a rising union efforts are happening throughout the country and being opposed. It's following the slaughter of World War I. It's at a time of real advances in science. So there's a changing sort of intellectual, religious, political landscape in the country. And of course, it's happening in the midst of prohibition. This is the Jazz Age, prohibition, which was a major cause that Bryan advocated and pushed for. So in a sense, that some of the challenges that are facing us today were being confronted at that time. And the trial and the battle between Bryan and Darrow is a manifestation of that. So I'm just going to read a couple of quotes that kind of sets the table for the trial in terms of what they were thinking about this. So this is a quotation from Darrow. He writes, "Ignorance and fanaticism is ever busy and needs feeding. Always it is feeding and gloating for more. Today it is the public school teachers, tomorrow the private. The next day the preachers, the lecturers, the magazines, the books, the newspaper." And after a while, Your Honor, this is a statement he's making in court, "It is the setting of man against man, creed against creed, until with flying banners, and beating drums, we are marching backward to the glorious ages of the 16th century, when bigots lighted flames to burn the men who dared to bring any intelligence and enlightenment and culture to the human mind." So for Darrow, this is very much about freedom of thought and the value of education. The book begins with a quote from William Jennings Bryan, who says, "I fear the plutocracy of wealth, and I respect the aristocracy of learning, but I thank God for the democracy of the heart. And that democracy of the heart is a phrase we'll get back to, which it's very important for us to understand the democracy of Brian's heart. All right, so we'll start, to get a sense of the deeper issues here. It is, important for us to look into as much as we can the heart of William Jennings Bryan. Again, he was this towering figure, known as a hero for the working class, hero for the oppressed, for family values, and again, seen as in many sense a progressive. But there was something deeper going on that doesn't get as much attention today, and that comes from that some of his political and moral views. All right. So the problem, as he says, it was not with science. He didn't have a problem with science, but with Darwinism, which he claimed was not a science, but a speculation and a hypothesis. It's as much as this trial is about evolution, it's more about what evolution represented in people's minds rather than the theory itself, because it's not clear that Bryan or many of the people involved in this really understood how Darwin's theory worked. And it's clear in Bryan's mind, Darwinism, he was being equated with social Darwinism. Right? And social Darwinism was an idea that had nothing to do with Charles Darwin. It's developed, and it became sort of a reigning view during the Gilded Age, and it was that the natural law is survival of the fittest, survival of the strongest, and that's how things ought to be. The species, the races are improved, right, by this winnowing of natural selection, in which the weaker, the less able, the less intelligent, the poorer are, kind of cut out, right? And room is made for the superior to rise to the top. And this was used as an argument against any sort of social net that would help the poor, the disabled, the oppressed. Right? It was seen that was weakening the race, weakening the species. And it was used as a justification for all sorts of terrible social policies. And Bryan is, railing against that injustice. And he's equating with social Darwinism and then associating social Darwinism with evolution. And of course, evolution in his mind meant atheism, right? So as he's arguing against this, he's seeing this also in terms of intellectual elites versus common people, right? The good common people who make up the backbone of this country. So a couple of quotes from him. He argues that the cultured crowd regard religion as a superstition, good for the ignorant, but one can outgrow the necessity of religion when he reaches a certain stage of intellectual development. Intellectuals have led civilization to the verge of a bottomless abyss. Right? Darwinism cannot save the world. It can only make the wreck of civilization complete. Right? So he's casting this in existential terms. Right? It's not merely a question of freedom of conscience. It's not merely a question of science and the scientific theory. This is a challenge, right, to the very existence of civilization. And the antidote to this disease that's spreading, from the intellectual classes and undermining the bedrock of civilization, the antidote is religion, but not just any religion. Right? As he writes, the world needs an international anthem, and there is none save the song that startled the shepherds at Bethlehem. On earth, peace and goodwill toward men. So the salvation, the remedy, was Christianity, and specifically a fundamentalist Christianity. Right? This was the remedy for the ills affecting America. Fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, a version of Protestantism, is really something that develops in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. And it is a reaction, it is within Protestant churches between more traditionalists and an increasing number of liberal Protestant thinkers who have reconciled Protestant Christianity with modernity, right? Who have found a way to live as Christians and people who accept science, and particularly evolution. The idea within that group, that mindset, something called theistic evolution, is that God designed the laws of evolution, right, and set them in motion. And so what Darwin is discovering is not antithetical to religion. It is just one more step in understanding how God has fashioned the world. Right? It raises problems with a literal reading of Genesis. It absolutely does. And that's what the fundamentalists are pushing against, right? This increasing liberalism and modernization that they see creeping into Protestant Christianity. And it's a backlash against that, right? Where they're going to return to the fundamentals, right? A literal reading of the Bible. And that's the school of thought that Brian is coming out of. And so again, not only is he pushing back against the atheist and the intellectual elite, he has a very strong condemnation of liberal Protestant pastors. So he was an advocate for the banning of evolution, but not just the banning of books on evolution. He also supported banning books that did not support a traditional understanding of American history. Again, he writes, if teachers, sarcastically, if teachers are allowed to undermine the Bible, well, why object to them undermining American history? He goes further. There was an actual case that was coming up in which a city council was trying to ban a history book that they felt was not duly patriotic. And they eventually did ban this book. So Brian is writing to the mayor to congratulate him. And he says, I think you are right, insisting that people who pay taxes have a right to decide what will be taught as history. Right? That sounds like it was ripped from the current headlines. Right? Brian took this analogy to an even more concerning direction. He writes, on the same ground, the people who pay taxes have a right to protest against the teaching of irreligion in public schools. Right? And he claimed that he was now engaged in the biggest reform of his life, quote, to save the Christian faith from those who are trying to destroy it. So William Jennings Bryant is what we would today term a Christian nationalist. We'll talk a little bit more about Christian nationalism's impact, but the term is now understood to mean this. A Christian nationalist is someone who believes that the United States was founded as a Christian nation, that its laws and founding documents were based on biblical values, and that the United States ought then to be recognized as a Christian nation, and with Christianity assuming a privileged position. So this is something very significant today, not something new. And again, Brian was a major advocate of that. But not only was he a Christian nationalist, he was a white supremacist and so a racist. So we get a quotation from the book. This is where he's talking about the Negro question. Okay, and he writes, when conditions force the two races to live under the same government, in the same country, the more advanced race never has consented and probably never will consent to be dominated by the less advanced. Here, the more advanced races always exercise the right to impose conditions upon those less advanced. And he argued that there's the idea that the races could ever enjoy equal status was something to be passionately opposed. Right? So he's not only a Christian nationalist, he is a white Christian nationalist. And there's a lot of scholarship now on Christian nationalism. And the studies show that there's a clear distinction between Black Christian nationalists, right? So Black Americans, predominantly Black churches who ascribe to Christian nationalists and white Christian nationalists. The difference, though, is how those views are expressed politically. So, for example, Black Christian nationalists believe Christianity is the bedrock of civilization, and that Christian values should be guiding our lawmaking and our politics. They tend not to agree that the United States should be declared a Christian nation, nor do they have a feeling that there should be any sort of religious test or litmus test for politicians, while those views are very popular among white Christian nationalists. So in terms of Black Christian nationalism, it really seems to be more of an expression of their commitment to Christianity as a moral worldview, while with white Christian nationalists, it's increasingly becoming much more about the nationalism and whiteness than it is specifically about Christianity. As I said, so now that this is tremendously important, white Christian nationalists have played an outsized role in recent events in this country. They put Donald Trump into office twice. Donald Trump is just statistically, he would not be president were it not for the support of white Christian nationalists. Now, often this discussion about religious support of Trump, it focuses on evangelical Christians. But the more nuanced view is that and there's a tremendous overlap between evangelical Christians and white Christian nationalists, but it's not perfect, and there are many evangelical Christians who have and continue to oppose Donald Trump without being evangelical without being Christian nationalists. But white Christian nationalists put Trump into power. And it's been argued by scholars of religion, scholars of politics, that the insurrection on January 6th was a white Christian nationalist insurrection. And there's plenty of resources online, analyzing the language, the imagery, the signs and symbols that were present and dominating on January 6th, very much in line with the white Christian nationalist view. White Christian nationalists are a major force in pushing for major changes in law in the United States. They very much behind. Again, we can't equate, for example, in the argument, the push against abortion rights, right? Not everybody who opposed abortion is a white Christian nationalist, but white Christian nationalism is has been a major political force for pushing against abortion rights, the current attack on transgender rights, the attack on education in this country, and they have a major supporter in Donald Trump. I'm sure many of you are aware of this, but if not, it's something we all should be aware of and very concerned about. And again, it's just recently that Donald Trump announced, with all the fanfare that Trump likes to have when he announces anything, that he's establishing a task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias. Anti-Christian bias. So on the face of that, it's unconstitutional because it's privileging one religion. Had he established a task force to eradicate anti-religious bias, there would still be cause for us to be concerned, seriously concerned, but he didn't even care to cover it up. It's anti-Christian bias. And this comes from the White House website. So just quickly, it's a long document, well, not too long, a few pages. Says the task force shall meet as required by the chair and will take all appropriate action to review the activities of all executive departments and agencies, including state, justice, the FBI, the Department of Labor, Health and Human Services, the Department of Education, right, Homeland Security, Equal Employment, and to identify any unlawful anti-Christian policies, practices, or conduct by an agency to the purpose and policy of this order. the ostensible evidence or reason for this is what he claimed was anti-Christian, illegal attacks on Christians, particularly during the Biden administration. And the particular examples are several women who were arrested for illegally blocking access to an abortion site. And these people have all been pardoned by Donald Trump. But we can see that this is so broad, and again, understanding that the bias against Christianity is a disagreement with, right, an opposition to a very particular form of Christianity. And we can see this again, and we'll continue to see this popping up in terms of federal research. It's part, again, of the attack on transgender rights, the LGBTQ community at large. This feeds into, again, I don't want to equate the two, but this attack on federal grants that fund scientific and other scholarly research, right? The attacks on the Department of Education, right? All of these are out of, the autocratic and anti-democratic playbook, right? So it's all of one piece, right? The anti-science, right? The the pro-Christian religious move of a particular kind, right? The assault on education, on media, right? The attempt to undermine or take over the courts. As we saw in his first administration, packing the Supreme Court with not only very conservative judges, but judges with a very pro and more conservative Christian outlook, right? So it is this perhaps unfair, given the very anti-populist, the plutocratic nature of Trump's administration and his outlook. We can imagine that, to be fair, that Brian would be horrified by that, but the choice to use Christianity, to use this idea of religious bias as a tool to push these things forward is something that, again, many conservative Christians, particularly Christian nationalists, are on board with. So it would be an interesting challenge to Brian's commitment to the poor to see, and Christianity, to see it being weaponized in this way. So that's all bring me again to talk now. The second point, or maybe the main point of this, is the moral and the political significance of science and science education. Excuse me. So going back to the philosopher that's influenced me most, John Dewey, in this great essay on philosophy and civilization, he's arguing in that piece about the critical thinking as a bedrock of a democratic civilization, right? And Dewey, the great philosopher of education and democracy, and saw the two, right? That democracy needs an educated citizenry, that it requires people to be able to think critically in order for democracy really to be an expression of the will of the governed, rather than having a populace that's easily led by demagogues. We need this is what protects our freedom, right? A population that can engage in critical thinking, and he sees, because a critical philosophy that requires science. He writes, "There can be no great philosophy without great science." And again, what Dewey is seeing is that our thinking about the world, about society, about how best to create and sustain flourishing communities and lives requires our thinking to be informed by the best findings of science. This is not that science will tell us what to do, but as we're trying to decide what to do, as we're trying to live out our values, right? We need to understand how to make that practicable, how to actually implement our values, how to create communities and movements that will be successful, right, in supporting our values. And to do that, we need to understand how the world works. This is a particular how to put passion of mine, bias of mine, when I teach, I very much try to keep my particular political opinions out of the classroom, but I'm very clear about this moral opinion. And particularly when I teach the Introduction to the Cognitive Science program. And I point out, I think it's a very interesting course. We cover a lot of, interesting academic scholarly questions. But one section, the longest section, is always on moral cognition. And I tell my students, I think this is the ultimate value of understanding cognitive science, because this is helping us to understand how human behavior works, how human minds, process information, how biases are formed, how they're recognized, and how they're countered. Without understanding how humans receive and act on information and threats and fears, we are left unprepared to engage in fruitful dialogue, right? Peaceful, constructive dialogue, or activism that's going to change minds, right? That's going to be able to put out there a position, a strategy that's not just going to appeal, right, to our fellow in-group members, right? That is something that can speak across a divide. We need to understand the dynamics of human decision-making and valuing. And so I think that's the importance of cognitive science. So Dewey's, obviously a great advocate of that. But in terms of, the moral value of science, I think one of the most powerful arguments was made by a predecessor, Charles Sanders Peirce, who was seen as the founder of pragmatism, this great, American philosophical tradition. And earlier he wrote an article called "On the Fixity of Belief." And what he was interested in this book, in this article, not a book, is how is it that humans come to make decisions? And he argued that there were four ways, right? The first is tenacity. And that's basically, so again, to step back a little bit, what Peirce says is when we start to think about things and question things when we have doubt. Doubt is the beginning of inquiry. And doubt, he says, is an irritation. It's an irritating sensation, right? And inquiry is an attempt to get rid of that irritating sensation. So inquiry is guided toward, or is aimed at eliminating the irritation, not finding the truth, right? But finding an answer that's going to relieve us of our tension, our stress, or anxiety. And I personally think there's a lot of contemporary cognitive science that supports this, right? So tenacity, because one way is just to get a position and stick with it and not listen to anybody who has anything different to say, to shut them out, to demean them, or just not to associate with anybody who might think differently from you, right? So you avoid that anxiety of doubt by just keeping a completely closed mind to anything else. He says that has some value, right? But it leads to a very antisocial sort of life. And for social creatures, that's not the best way. Another way is authority, which is, right, is our group, right? So the tenacity is too individualistic. We're social creatures. So we get a set of beliefs that our group believes in, right? And it becomes our dogma, it becomes our belief. And so you're just surrounding yourself with people who think like you. And you suppress or keep out any views or any people who hold views that are different to that of your group, right? I think this is a much more common strategy, and it is manifest in the polarization we see on both left and right in the country today. And the third, and we'll talk about the problem with that, he calls a priori, and this is a more intellectual, right? This is a rationalization, an intellectual, rational justification of either your personal belief or your group's belief, right? And then finally, there's science. So I'm going to read a little bit from this. He says, the value of science is that it is the only one of the four methods which presents any distinction of a right and a wrong way. Right? Tenacity, I shut myself out from all influences. Whatever I think necessary to doing this is necessary according to this method. There's nothing in the method that can justify the belief, because then you're not interested in justifying it. You're just interested in not being stressed by different opinions. So with the method of authority, right? The state may try to push down heresy by means which are poorly set to accomplish this purpose. But the only test on the method of authority is what your group thinks, right? There's no question about, is my group right or wrong? This is what we think. That provides a social norm, and it allows us to feel connected to others, but still avoid the anxiety of doubt. A priori method, the very essence of it is to think as one is inclined to think. One example of this, and we can do it politically in terms of religion, theology is a form of a priori thinking. Theology is intellectually sophisticated, philosophically sophisticated, but in effect, and this is my thinking on this, theology is a rationalization of a particular religious worldview, right? It's not something that's willing to question whether that worldview is right or wrong, but how to understand it in a way that it seems right. And again, so the very essence of this a priori, and we get it in philosophy, we get it in politics, is to think as one is inclined to think. But with the scientific method, the case is different. I may start with the known and observed facts to proceed to the unknown, yet the rules I follow in doing so may not be such as to get me the answer I would approve of, right? So the test of whether I am truly following the method is not an immediate, the test of whether I am truly following the scientific method is not an immediate appeal to my feelings and my purposes, but on contrary involves the application of the method. That is, it's the only method that gives us answers that are not dependent on what we want to believe, what makes us comfortable, right? Hence, it is that bad reasoning as well as good reasoning is possible, right? And this is what the scientific method is saying. We may think that this is what is going to be the outcome of my experiment, but the facts show something different. It's the only thing that can correct my initial hypothesis. It's the only thing that can correct, right, or work as a pushback against what I want to be true, what I need to be true. So following, being committed to the scientific method is being committed to intellectual humility, the fact that I can be wrong, right? And what I believe can't just be based on what I want to be true. Another virtue of this, he goes on, and one of the things people argue against science is it keeps correcting itself. It keeps making mistakes. You know, the beginning of the COVID, we said, don't wear masks. Now we find out, oh, wear masks. And now we're not too sure if mask wearing was right. Why should I believe this? Well, see, science doesn't work. But that's actually science working, right? Because knowing stuff is hard. Believing stuff is easier. Knowing stuff is hard. And science, does make mistakes. And that's part of its virtue, is that it can be corrected, right? It puts ideas out there that others can now challenge using the same method, so an agreed upon method, and find out, those beliefs were wrong, and now we can update our belief. Science is the only method, right? Approach to knowledge that gives us this, right? And it's something woefully missing from contemporary political debates. So it's not only science itself, but it's teaching of science, right? Understanding, right? How science works, right? Teaching that attitude of intellectual humility and seeing that getting things wrong is part of the process of getting things right eventually. That's something that needs to be taught, and that needs to be taught early on. Even more important than the particular findings of science, I would argue. It's science as a method of thinking critically and communally. It's a social process, right? That gives it its ultimate moral and social significance. Just quickly, I know I'm running out of time, but part of this I wanted to talk about is the moral significance of getting science right. And so science has practical, clinical significance, but it also has philosophical significance, right? And sometimes getting the science wrong leads to problematic philosophical moral positions. This is set out beautifully and in great detail, in my view, argued persuasively by the new book by our friend David Spritzen, The Human Emergence and Our Place in the Natural World. What he's setting out, which is an argument I'm very sympathetic to, which I think is correct, is how even some of our best science, right, really presents a view of the world that's very reductionistic, materialistic, mechanistic. And from this, it's very hard to see the place for human freedom, human dignity, right? Morality. And so within that scientific worldview, as it's often presented, it's very hard to find a worldview, a sense of ourselves that's going to give us sort of the moral, spiritual nourishing that I think people are really seeking, right? But again, the point that he brings out is that this is coming not from the science itself, but from the way that sort of the philosophical justifications of the science, the philosophical arguments that are being drawn, often by scientists, but philosophers also, from the science, right? And this is the role of philosophy in science. Philosophy is one of the cognitive sciences, is being able to pull out those assumptions that are coming from the science, right, and subject them to critical review, critical analysis. And there are always assumptions built into the scientific method. It is a job of philosophers to highlight that. And David's book is of a moment where there is this pushback, and in particular within my field of cognitive science, against that view, right? Again, in cognitive science, it's the view that the mind is just a computer. And so AI will be able to replicate everything humans do. There's a certain philosophical commitment implicit in that, which I would argue and do argue, and David, I think, would agree with me, just doesn't stand up to critical inquiry. So it's important for us to understand, right, to get the science right. And philosophy, and that's not just an empirical question, it is also a philosophical question. All right, I'll finish with, while going back to Dewey, while he also believed that without, there can be no great philosophy without great science. He also argued that there can be no great science without philosophy. Okay, and I'll leave you with that. Thank you.